There we are. Hello and welcome back to readings from the Seed of Yggdrasill. And we have now reached chapter 5.5. Chapter 5 is titled The Loss of the Golden Age in Old Norse Myths. And chapter 5.5 is Who Really Killed Baldur? A Murder Mystery. And it begins with a quote from the Vegtamskvida. That's an Edda poem about Odin going into the underworld, calling himself Vegtam, which means the one who is familiar with the way to hell. Fram reid Odin, foldväger dundi. Han kom att hofu helja ranni. Då reid Odin fyrir austandyr, dar han vissi völuleidi. Nam han vittugri Grógaldr kveda, ons naudig reis, nås ord kvad. Forth rode Odin, the earth path resounded, as he reached the path to the high hall of Hel. Then rode Odin to the east of death's door. There he knew of a witch's grave. He knew wisely to sing the spells of choice death, or Grógaldr. He made her rise, and reluctantly she sang the words of the dead. The myth of Baldur's death has so often been interpreted as a fertility myth, or a myth of the changing seasons, that it is a challenge to introduce a new way of understanding it. Baldur is so easily discarded as the young god, the vegetation god, or even the sun god, the latter sun god, otherwise completely unknown in Norse myth and religion, where the sun goddess is a fact and no sun god ever shown on the sky. Why? Well, the seasonal interpretation of the Baldur myth is based on comparative mythology, where Baldur is likened to an ancient African, Middle Eastern and Mediterranean god, to gods such as Attis, Dumuzi, Adonis, Osiris, and so on. Young gods who were the lovers or the sons or the brothers of the great goddess, dying annually in ritual, interpreted by moderns to represent the death of vegetation and growth during winter. They were mourned, buried, and reborn by the goddess each year. But when it comes to the Norse Baldur, the place name material and other sources strongly suggest that Baldur may not have been a god that was worshipped at all. Like Loki, he is a mythical character, a character made up by poets in order to create good stories that reveal important messages. Whereas Attis, Dumuzi, Osiris, and the other dying gods were real gods in their time, worshipped and mourned annually, celebrated at their return in spring, there is no sign whatsoever that Baldur was worshipped in the same way, or that he was ever even worshipped. The Norse poets may have borrowed the theme of the dying god from other cultures, as the Norse people, like most ancients, always happily borrowed wherever they liked something. However, they borrowed it with a purpose, to convey an important message to their audience and to the initiates of possible initiates of mystery cults. They may very well have borrowed the deeper purpose of this basic myth too, a purpose that transcends the obvious fertility myth. When the myth of Isis and Osiris became incorporated into classical mystery religions in the Roman Empire, The Egyptian Osiris no longer represented the dying and reviving vegetation, if he ever did, but he represented the dying and reviving soul of human beings, reborn through his union with the great All-Soul, his sister or wife, Isis. Isis was, importantly, called the Savior Goddess, the Savior, many centuries before Christ was even conceived of, since she saved the souls of her devotees from Hades, resurrecting them from the Shadowlands and offering them a place in bright Elysium, the divine realm. Modern interpreters often seem obsessed with interpreting pagan myths within the frame of fertility cults, especially when a goddess takes precedence. Yet the classical interpretations show that people in olden times were not always that obsessed with fertility, after all. They were in fact concerned with the fate of their souls after death, in the purity of their souls in life. It is from the point of view of a spiritual mystery that we ought to read the Balder myth. All right, before I move on reading here, I haven't really explained mystery religions or mystery cults yet in this book. It's something that comes later, because after I had written The Maiden with the Mead, and well, I was looking for comparative ways of understanding it, that is, by looking at other ancient mythologies. And I remember I was a bit surprised when I read Tacitus, that Roman general historian who wrote about the Germans. That is, the Germans was what the Germani, that was the name that the Romans applied to the people that we now call Germanic people. But they didn't think of themselves as Germanic. They came from many different tribes or nations, quite movable nations. So maybe tribe is a better word. And they called themselves by different things, but they did share language, the so-called the Germanic language, and they also shared a lot of cultural elements and religious elements, but they were a bit different and they did have different identities. Much like today in Scandinavia, Norway, Sweden and Denmark, we are sort of very close-knit culturally and linguistically, but we do think of ourselves as different people. It's not like we think that we are all, well, we are different nations, and that was the truth about these tribes too. Well, anyway, Tacitus says, and this is 100 AD around, and he says that the Germans, the Suevi people, that was a confederation that was far in the north, possibly in Scandinavia. The Suevi people, they worshipped Isis, the goddess Isis, and at first that was strange. He even says that he writes that he is not sure how this foreign goddess came in to be worshipped by the Germans, but it had evidently happened. Now, the Romans tended to always translate the names of other people's gods and goddesses they identified them with their own, because as they believed that the gods were real. So if you had a goddess of the earth, a god of the sky or the sun, or underworld, death, anything, they were obviously the same god everywhere. And so other people just worshipped them by different names and had slightly different stories and things like that. So the Romans would always write about the Germans worshipping Mercury when it was in fact Odin, or that they worshipped Jove, Jupiter, but that was in fact Thor. Or Thor could also be interpreted in his capacity as a hero god, a warrior god. He was also likened to Hercules, and Njörður or Aegir, they were referred to as Neptune, the god, and on we go. And Tivas was referred to as Mars, so they always translated it. So when we see Isis, Isis is an Egyptian goddess. In Egypt, she was actually called Aset. but the Romans called her Isis, and so in English Isis. But she was by then a Roman goddess, and when they looked at the German people and saw that they were worshipping a goddess, they would figure out what sort of function this goddess had, and then they would liken her or identify her to a goddess that they knew. So the fact is that the goddess Isis in the Roman Empire was a primary goddess of a mystery religion. And a mystery religion, the word mystery here comes from Greek mysteria, which means, or meant, not mystery exactly, but initiation. So these were initiation religions. A person who wanted to become initiated had to go through certain rites and had to experience a symbolic or, sort of an experience of dying, of death, and then returning. And it is in the moment of death that the goddess appears and that he or she receives these revelations and deeper understanding. And when they return to life, first of all, they know that after death they will be saved because they have already established a love union with the goddess. And they had to go through various trials. So it's very similar to, very, very similar in structure. And we're going to return to this subject. The thing is that I wanted to say that mystery religions existed within the larger polytheistic religions of the Romans. And because of what I have discovered in recovering the structure of initiation in Norse mythology, I'm quite convinced that maybe some sort of mystery religion also existed here. And it would not have been for everyone, obviously. It's a bit like in India today. In India, most people worship lots and lots of different gods and goddesses in many different ways, regionally, locally, and all over the country. And their religion is called Hinduism, but Hinduism contains I think hundreds, maybe thousands of different little paths. And some of them are paths of enlightenment, paths of meditation, parts of personal spiritual growth. And these paths are not for everyone. They're for this particularly specially interested who also have the opportunity to go searching for their own spirit's awakening. And I think that it could have been, it was similar in the Roman Empire, and I think it could have been quite similar here too. So, let's move on. When I first began to interpret Norse myths based on translating the names of characters and places, the Baldur myth was one of the first to provide me with a revelation. The myth of Baldur is partly told in Snorri's Gylfaginning, where Baldur is first introduced. Another son of Odin is Baldur, and about him there is much good to relate. He is the best, and all praise him. He is so fair to look at and so bright that he illuminates light. He is the wisest of the Æsir, and the one who speaks most eloquently, and he is also the most diplomatic or compromising. But that trait, that diplomacy, that compromising trait means that no judgment of his can possibly stand. He's too good at seeing every side, so there will be no decision made. He lives where it is called Breiðablik, which means broad vision, and this is in heaven. In that place there can be nothing unclean, as it is said here. It is called Breiðablik, where Baldur has his halls raised. In that country, I know, lies the least harmful runes. So there are very little harmful fate going on in Baldur's realm. And later we hear of his death. This story begins with this. that Balder the Good dreamt great dreams that foretold of a danger to his life. When he had told the Aesir about his dreams, they held a council, and they agreed to pray for Balder's life to be saved from all dangers. Frigg demanded of fire and water, iron and all kinds of minerals, the rocks, the earth, the trees, the diseases, the animals, the birds, the poisons, and the serpents, that they should not harm Balder. When this task was completed and declared, Balder and the Aesir entertained themselves thus, that he, Balder, should take a central place on their parliament fairs, and that they should shoot at him. Others should axe or maim him, and others throw rocks at him, and whatever they did caused him no harm. And this game the Aesir thought to be great fun. But when Loki, son of Leaf Island, Laufeyarson, saw this, it made him angry that nothing harmed Balder. He took upon himself the shape of a woman and went to Frigg in the moist halls, Fensalar. Frigg asked the woman what the Aesir were doing at Parliament. The woman replied that they were all shooting at Balder, and that it did not harm him. Then said Frigg, "Neither weapon nor tree will harm Balder. I have made everything swear to death." "Has absolutely everything sworn to never harm Balder?" asked the woman. Frigg replied, "Well, there grows a small plant to the west of Valhall. He is called the mistletoe. I thought him too young to demand oaths from." Then the woman went away. Loki took the mistletoe and tore him apart and went to the parliament. And when I refer to the mistletoe as a he and a him, that's because I have translated this directly, and in the Norse language, things and plants and everything has a gender. It's either masculine, feminine, or neutral, so 3 genders. And here the mistletoe is a he. That's why we refer to the mistletoe as a he, even though he is a plant. Loki took the mistletoe and tore him apart and went to the parliament. Höður, strife, Höður's name means strife, stood outside of the circle of men because he was blind. Think of that. Strife is blind. Conflict is blind. Aggression, blind, ignorant. Loki asked him, "Why are you not shooting at Balder?" "Because I am blind," Strife replied, "and besides I have no weapons." Then said Loki, "You should be able to do as they do and show Balder the proper respects like they are doing. I shall direct you about where he stands. Shoot at him with this twig." Strife took the mistletoe and shot at Balder as Loki directed him. The shot went right through Balder, and he fell dead to the ground. And this is the greatest sorrow that has ever happened to both Aesir and to human beings. Now, the courage of broad perception, the wisdom parable of Balder. To briefly sum up the myth, Balder is the child of Odin and Frigg. He lives in a realm called Breidablik. He is married to a woman called Nanna Nepresdottir, and they are very much in love. He is beautiful, wise, and much loved by everyone. He is so objectively fair, as in compromising, diplomatic, that he cannot pass judgments. He represents all that is good and precious. Then he has dreams that are interpreted as omens by the other gods, omens of his early death. His mother, the goddess Frigg, moves about the world and asks all things to not harm Balder. The gods, ever fun-loving, play at harming Balder, since nothing can actually harm him. Then the tragedy occurs as Loki, moved by his jealousy of Balder, wrests out the knowledge that he needs and proceeds to actually harm Balder, letting another, Höður Blindi, perform the crime and thus receive the punishment. So, now let us try what the story sounds like if you translate the names of the characters and the places. Let us begin with the first 3 sentences of my summary above, and now with the translations, allowing us to come closer to what the Old Norse audience actually heard, because they understood the meaning of the names. Courage is the child of spirit and love. He lives in a realm called Broad Vision. He is married to a woman called Understanding, daughter of the Ring, and they are very much in love. Now, my translation of Nanna as understanding is a little bit questionable, I think, but the rest is, it's actually, it might just mean woman, but yeah, just, I wasn't prepared for this here. I'm just going to continue reading. The thing is, the moment names are translated, we begin to perceive the myth differently. As soon as the parable is deciphered, it becomes easy to see. It is such a simple way of relating the most basic yet profound of all wisdoms. The myths are no longer just stories about some mythical people, but parables that convey a deeper message, that true courage, Baldur, is born of the union between spirit and love, Odin and Frigg, and that this leads to broad vision, broad understanding, broad perception. This is the best of all qualities, to take a non-judgmental attitude, to nurture one's capacity to grasp the wider picture rather than pass judgment, and to nurture one's capacity to grasp the wider picture rather than make judgment, and to nurture a deep love for learning and wholeness with which this quality lives in union. The ring represents wholeness. As long as Baldur lives among the gods, the quality that he represents also lives among them. Thus, the world is a good place where the quality of this true courage is available to men and women, just like when Kvasir, the brew ingredient, moved freely through the world. The message is clear. Nothing can harm the person or the society who possesses such a quality within. This sacred quality was once present in the world, yet another metaphor for the golden age of wisdom and peace. So, only one thing can harm and destroy this inner quality. We're speaking of the inner quality of a society or of a person, an individual too. It is what Baldur represents, the open-mindedness, basically, his ability to see the widely, his ability to see the complexity of things, his ability to see the sides of things, the different perspectives, the different sides of everything. But that makes it very hard to just make a decision or pass a judgment of what's right or wrong, which is why he can't be a judge, because he's always going to see, well, he's just too fair. But as a quality, this is divine. This is something that the gods really, really appreciate and really enjoy. And they test it. This is really possible that this quality is like, it makes a person indestructible. But it isn't exactly indestructible after all. Almost, but not completely. Because there is one thing that can harm and destroy this inequality, and that is another inequality, represented by Höður Blindi, whose name literally translates as Strife the Blind, or perhaps you should just say blind aggression. Blindness is here a metaphor for ignorance, for a refusal to see the truth. The aggression blinding one's understanding, so it's it's not blindness as such, but a way of saying that someone is unable to see something, understand something. So I shall continue to call the killer ignorant aggression. This negative quality has always been there as a potential, watching the games of the gods, but it was harmless because no one gave it weapons and no one gave it directions. It is always our choice whether we will lend weapons and guide the hands of our basest qualities. Only Loki, eventually, decides to make use of ignorant aggression. Loki, whose name rhymes with Logi, flame, and who often represents, it seems, the fire of passion, not necessarily a negative thing. It is the source of vitality, of life force itself. It is the heat that gave vital power and beautiful colors to the first people, but which, here, in the thrall of jealousy, is hatred and anger. These feelings rank among the feelings that must be conquered in the myths of initiation, as we saw when young Helgi went into the fjord of hatred to vanquish the giant called Hati, hatred, before he could be worthy of wedding his Valkyria bride. This message of nurturing the proper inner qualities, whether on an individual or a societal level, is the true meaning of the life and death of Baldur. So the first answer to the murder mystery is thus that Baldur represents human virtues, divine virtues that we all possess, virtues or qualities that once were nurtured, the virtues of courage, objectivity, unprejudiced, kindness, and wisdom. These virtues, these good virtues, were murdered by another human trait: ignorance, jealousy, and blind aggression. However, there are more murderers on the scene. Hidden powers are pulling strings for a secret and strange purpose. Frigg's secret. As mentioned above, the myth of Baldur and his death is yet another parable of the Golden Age and about how and why it was lost. The complex variety of myths surrounding this one single theme belies the common preconceptions that myths are superstitious fairy tales. Instead, we are presented with numerous aspects of the answers to difficult questions: why the world is in such a sorry state, what caused it, and what is needed to restore the healthy balance. As we saw in the myth of the millstone, we learn that people of great knowledge, such as King Wisdom, abused and underestimated natural powers, the giantesses, because of unchecked greed. The solution to this problem is to wake up one's wisdom and listen to the ancient tales, and to begin respecting the natural powers once more. In the myth of Kvasir, we learn that people of great knowledge began to disrespect their fellow beings, monopolizing wisdom and hiding it away from the world, hoping to attain immortality for themselves without succeeding. The solution to this problem is to dare the darkness of the underworld, conquer one's fears, and reach the realm of universal memory. Now, in the myth of Baldur, we learn about how wisdom was killed because the virtues of jealous anger and ignorant aggression, blindness and strife took precedence, instead of the great appreciation that the gods of the mind, the Aesir, showed virtues such as broad-mindedness and a non-judgmental attitude. However, the story does not end there. Just as Odin sought the lost Mead in the underworld, restoring the path of wisdom to the world, so a path of initiation is instigated and, it would seem, planned. Trying to decipher myths is a bit like detective work. One begins to see suspects everywhere and to investigate every odd detail rather than ignoring it. For example, Frigg, who made such an effort of protecting her son, Baldur, freely allows Loki to obtain exactly the information that he needs in order to kill Baldur. The story implies that Frigg was tricked, since Loki had changed shape into that of a woman, so Frigg thought that she was speaking to a woman. but I, at least, have never seen anyone question this apparent naivety of the goddess, because in reality, the shape changing only means that Loki needed a woman's body in order to reach Frigg's realm, Fensalar, the moist halls. So it is difficult to make out exactly what this means, but we could at least suggest that these halls belong to the women's fair, to women's mysteries, and that Loki can only reach the mother goddess in her hall if he sort of is a woman, and evidently he can become one. This could be explained in various ways. If we understand that Loki is, as are most mythical characters, a trait rather than a person, he can possess either sex. As a trait, he is passion, desire, life force itself. The sex change can also be an example of Seidr, since we know that obtaining hidden knowledge and changing shape were important features that often go together of the mysterious art of Seidr. Several sources suggest that this art of sorcery and divination may have been considered a particularly feminine art, although males also practice it, risking their manly reputations. Male practitioners of Seidr, it seemed, could be called Seidberendir, which literally translates as a Seidr vagina, or perhaps the more elegant magical womb. The title quite strongly indicates that a magical change of sex from male to female may have been an important part of witchcraft practiced by men. I discussed this in much more detail and with more years of experience in my lecture series about Fjölkyngi. But this is what I wrote back then. So, that sex change may not just be about tricking the goddess into revealing her knowledge, although Loki might think he is tricking her. In fact, the Edda poem Lokasenni lets Loki think just that, only to learn, to his great chagrin, that everybody saw right through him. In the poem, Loki tries his utmost to offend all the gods and goddesses, getting so provoked that he finally reveals to Frigg, almost proudly, that he is responsible for her son Baldur's death. It says, En vil þú, Frigg, at eg fleiri telja, mina meinstafi. Eg því red þú rida serat, sidan Baldur at Salum. Loki says, Still you want, Frigg, that I tell more about my harmful runes, and I tell you that I cause this, that you will never see ride Baldur to these halls. As Loki thinks he has triumphed over the mother goddess, Freya turns to him and informs him of a known fact, namely that Frigg knows all fate, and thus knew exactly what was happening when Loki wrested out her knowledge. Freya says, Örrer þú Loki, þú Yggdrasill ljóta leið stafi. Örlög Frigg hygg ekkat allviti, þótt hon sjálfki segi. Deluded are you, Loki, when you brag, reckoning up all your lowly, hateful rune carvings. Rune carvings here mean sort of affecting fate. Of destiny, Frigg knows all in totality, I believe, though she herself never speaks of her knowledge. And this all-knowing quality in Frigg is also repeated by Snorri. Thus, Frigg cannot, as Freya points out, possibly have been tricked by Loki. Obviously she knew what was going on. She must have known what would happen. Despite the great sorrow it caused her, the mother goddess, whose name simply means love, or actually more accurately, beloved, she allowed the death of her beloved son, Baldur. And she was even instrumental in its happening. So, next to Loki and to Höður, our detective work leads us to a third suspect, Baldur's own mother, Frigg, the good-bad polarity suddenly becomes less clear. If the goddess of love, omniscience, and fate herself paved the way to this death, maybe there is a deeper reason to it. Odins secret. Odin kvad. Fjöldek for, fjöldek freistadek, fjöldek røynda regin. Vat mælti Odin adro bålstigi, skjalfer I øyra syni. Vafþrudnir kvad. Øy manne that veit, vat du I årdaga, sagder I øyra syni. Feig om mønni, melta ek mina forna stafi, og om Ragnarök. Nu ek vid Odin deildak, mina ordspeki, thu ert avisaster væra. Odin said, much did I travel, much did I try, much did I test out the powers. What did Odin whisper as he climbed the pyre himself into the ears of his son? Tremendous wheel, powerful head veil said, no man knows what you in the beginning days spoke into the ears of your son. With a mouth wed to death did I speak my ancient rune carvings, and of Ragnarök. Now I have with Odin contended, for all my eloquent arts, you turned out to be the wisest. This is from Fjålsvinnsmál, the song of the powerful head veil, the poetic Edda. Balder is laid to rest on his remarkable ship, Hringhorni, the ringhorn. The ring is a reference to wholeness and completion, the horn a reference to the mead of memory. None of the gods have the strength to push that kind of ship onto its death journey, so they have to call upon the most powerful of all beings, the wolf-riding giantess, Hyårvarðsson, the fire spinner. As she pushes the ship onto its death journey, Balder's wife, Nanna, that is, Courage's wife, Understanding, dies with him on the pyre, representing the understanding that Courage loved so much. Then we come to our fourth suspect in the story, Odin. Why is he also a suspect? Because he too seems to have a purpose with the death of Balder. Just before the pyre is lit, Odin puts his ring, Draupnir, onto the pyre and whispers something into the ear of his son. We do not learn what he whispers, it is a secret. But we do know that the ring Draupnir is the very golden ring that drips 8 new rings every 9th night. This golden ring is continuously referred to in the law, representing, it seems, esoteric knowledge, divine wisdom, secret powers, wholeness, and immortality. We also know that this secret that Odin whispers into the ear of his son Balder is the secret that saves Odin's life when he meets the giant Vafthrudnir, the powerful head veil, in a duel of eloquence later. The giant's name means tremendous head veil and represents, as I see it, illusion. The illusion of the world which only Odin, through his endless questioning, may overcome. It is the answer to the question of what Odin whispered in Balder's ear that saves Odin from succumbing to illusion, for this is the one thing that illusion does not know. The secret which Balder takes with him to the underworld may be uncovered there, in a place where the recycling ring of divine knowledge is retrieved by those who manage to reach it. It is the key to conquering illusion and to resurrection from misty hell. The path begins, the journey to the underworld. The text that follows the death of Balder in Snorri's work provides an important clue to understand the secret purposes of Frigg and Odin. After the death of Balder, we learn that the Aesir are speechless, unable to utter any other sound than sobs of grief. Odin himself is broken by grief. None of the male Aesir are able to act in this shock, not until Frigg comes forth, as Snorri tells. When the Aesir had calmed down somewhat, Frigg took the word and asked which one of the Aesir would be willing to win all her goodwill and her love by riding the Hel road in an attempt to find Baldur, offering to Hel a ransom so that she may release Baldur and let him return to Åsgardr. In light of chapter 3, where I explored the initiation myths of a journey into the underworld in order to wake up the bright maiden and receive her mead and her embrace, the stated purpose of winning the goodwill and love of the goddess is by riding the Hel path, is in fact the answer to understand what is happening. The path of initiation is instigated, the path that leads the initiate into Hel in order to restore the lost treasures of the human and the divine heritage, symbolized by Baldur. It is also symbolized by the union between Baldur and Nanna, between courage and understanding, by the dripping ring and by the precious mead and by the maiden who serves it. This is our heritage as human beings, our spiritual heritage, as the poems often suggest. When Uttar, as we saw in chapter 3.5, claims the knowledge of the she-wolf in Hel, he is claiming, as Freyja repeatedly states, his heritage, the heritage which will lead him to Valhall. As we saw in 5.1, Baldur is ultimately connected with the mead that is hidden in the underworld, just like Kvasir. He is the essence of the mead, knowledge, wisdom, and immortality. In the beginning of Snorri's story, he mentioned the omen dreams of Baldur that led the goddess to demand an oath from all things. In the poetic Edda, there is a poem called the Vegtamskvida, Edda Baldur's Draumar, the Song of Waywant, or the Death of Baldur. And in this poem, we hear that Baldur dreams terrible dreams, which lead Odin on a journey into Hel. Odin has made the journey before, we learn, and he is Waywant. Thus, his nickname in the story, he is the one who is accustomed to the way of Hel, of death. Having been in Hel before, having been dead before, Odin has the knowledge needed to avoid the dangerous and deadly walls of Hel's high hall, and he rides to the east of it. The east indicates the sunrise, new life, a new possibility, and regeneration. To the east of Hel's hall is the grave of a Völva, an ancient oracle witch. Odin sings spells of choice death, Grógaldr, before the ancient mound, making the dead woman rise from her grave. This is exactly what the young Svipdagur did before his mother Groa's grave, in order to learn the spells needed to reach the bright realm of Menglöd. And, like Odin's dead woman, Groa was also a Völva. In the poem, Odin asks questions as to the fate of Baldur. The dead woman reveals that the precious mead, the bright power drink, is brewed in Hel for Baldur. She also reveals who shall kill Baldur and who shall avenge him. The avenger is called Vali, which, well, I have written here that it means the choice. It actually could refer to the word Val, which is used to describe the dead of Valhall, so it's or the dead who are slain. Another word, Val. Well, there are two words, Val and Valr, and one means choice, and the other means the slain. So it has something to do with the slain. It's not any slain; it's the slain who actually reach immortality, a state of immortality. So. And who are chosen by the Valkyrie or by Odin or by Freyja in the sources. So the one who is to kill who is to sort of avenge, metaphorically avenge what Baldur represents in the world. He is associated with a person who will reach a sort of immortality after death, will live in closeness to the gods after death. So as Odin learns this in Hel, he asks a most curious question. What are the maidens called? He asks. Those who are weeping and sobbing and throwing their veils to the sky. Even more curiously, the Völva refuses to answer the question, accusing Odin of trying to trick her, since he calls himself Way-want rather than Odin. Odin replies that she is no wise woman, no Völva, she is the mother of 3 trolls, a metaphor for Loki or for his lover Angerboda, the one who bids rage, the one who mothered the 3 trolls of death, greed and limitation, Hel, Fenrir and the Midgardr serpent. And thus ends the poem. All this seems confusing only until one puts 2 and 2 together. The poem refers to the path of initiation, where mead is offered by a maiden in the underworld. This is connected to the alternative afterlife in Valhall and to Baldur's resurrection. The choice, or the slain, the person who has who will come to Valhall, will restore Baldur by metaphorically avenging him. And the choice will avenge Baldur by putting ignorant aggression to the pyre. The restoration of Baldur on a personal level depends on the ability to let ignorant aggression or blind strife burn out. The reference to the weeping maidens is clearly a reference to the inner maiden, as we saw in the previous essay, the maiden who weeps, eagerly awaiting her lover to find her in the underworld, a maiden who seems to represent the inner soul, the personal fate goddess, wisdom and resurrection from death. This is hinted at only, given as a riddle to be solved. The dead woman refuses to reveal the identity of the maidens, as the old ogress of death and oblivion always resists the passing of the mead to the living. Hermod's journey then begins. His name means army of courage, or the courage of an army, implying that he is one person has the courage equivalent of a whole army. This is a reference to the meaning of Baldur's name, which also means courage. It takes courage indeed to go into the underworld while still alive. The references to the mead that awaits Baldur, the dripping ring, and the theme of resurrection from Hel are all powerful indicators that the path of initiation into the pagan mysteries have begun, and that this may be the ritual truth behind the Baldur myth. His death, the death of limitless perception and knowledge, is the reason why it has to be sought in the underworld forever after. So, we got to 5.6, the rape of the rejecter. Odin kvad. Verman heipt hæði, heftend of vinna, Edda Baldurs bana av bålväga. Völva kvad, rinder ber vala I Vestersölum, så man Odins soner, ein etter väga, hand tvär, när höfud kämper, ådr och bål ombör, Baldurs anskåta. Odin said, who will kill aggression, achieving due vengeance, by bringing the bane of courage of Baldur to the funeral pyre? The witch said, the rejecter bears choice in the western halls. Spirit's son will fight from the first night of his life, he washes not his hands, he combs not his hair, until he carries to the funeral pyre the bane of courageous spirits. When Odin travelled to Hel in order to learn more about the death of Balder in the Edda poem, he naturally asks who will avenge his son Balder. From a Viking Age perspective, this was expected. A murder, even when carried out by mistake, must always be avenged. Although the gods may have known that young Höder Blindi only wished to partake in the game that everybody else was playing, and although they may have known that Loki had manipulated his hand, it was Höder's shot that killed Balder, and the law of the time dictates that he is responsible and that Balder must be avenged. Someone related to Balder must do the killing and bring Balder's murderer to the funeral pyre. Since the other gods also seem to be related to Höder through relation or oath or of codependence, they must find someone from the outside, and Odin is given directions. He himself will father the avenger, a boy named Vali, to be mothered by a woman in western halls named Rinder. So, I wrote here that the name Vali translates as the choice, from Val, the choice, the same word that is used to describe the chosen dead of Valhall and the choosers of the dead, the Valkyrier. Now, actually, the word Valir and Valir are two different etymologies and two different origins. But it is a fact that the Val, the slain, is chosen by the gods or by the Valkyrier. I think the poets often play with their similarity in sound and meaning here. So I'm going to just continue reading this, just saying that the term Valir is not necessarily meaning the choice. It just means the dead who are chosen. Now, the name of his mother, Rinder, derives from the word rinda, to throw away, to throw back, to reject. The prose and poetic Eddas do not offer any explanations to why the mother of choice is called the rejecter. In the prose Edda, we hear only briefly of Rinder and Vali. Then there is the one who is called Orli or Vali, son of Odin and Rinder. He is courageous in battle and a particularly good bowman. Earth, mother of Thor, and Rinder, mother of Vali, are counted among the Åsynjur, the goddesses, because through marriage a woman or a giantess became a goddess. Through marriage to a god, obviously. Snorri also reveals that Vali is among the Æsir who will survive Ragnarök and recites the Fjålsvinnsmál, stanza 51. Vidar och Vali bygga ved goda, då slocknar surtalogi. The expander and the choice shall build in divine shrines when the flames of black soot acid are extinguished. Vali is also briefly mentioned in Fjålsvinnsmál, stanza 32, where we basically hear the same story as earlier, that Balder's avenger is born swiftly and begins to fight from when he is just 1 night old. On their own, the Eddas give very little information, but the story can still be deciphered to a considerable degree if we keep the meaning of names in mind. If we insist on reading the story of Balder, his death and the vengeance as a story about people, mythical and divine people that is, then the myth is little more than entertainment. However, if we remember that both Balder and his murderer have names that indicate that they represent qualities, the inner personal qualities of human beings, then the story becomes a beautiful and elegant parable about the plight of humanity. Balder is the courage born of the union between spirit and love, a courage that resides in broad view, that is a place of open-mindedness, of objectivity, ability to see widely, a meaning that is strengthened by the information given about Balder's personality, namely that he is incapable of passing judgments because he sees all aspects of a situation and thus must always compromise. The courage to remain in such a state is tremendous and leads to a union with completion, the wholeness of understanding symbolized in his marriage. This beautiful quality is treasured by the gods, who rejoice in its ability to withstand all onslaughts. It is invulnerable. The only thing that it is vulnerable to, it turns out, is another sort of trait. Jealousy, motivating blind aggression. The myth continues, letting us know that the trait that Balder represents may still be found through trials of initiation, but it also requires a sacrifice. It requires the birth of a choice, a valiant, courageous choice that does not hesitate to bring blind aggression to the pyre. The choice that destroys blind aggression will restore the courage of broad perception. In itself, this parable is astonishingly relevant to people today, as it was when it was created. But there is more to the myth. What about Rinder, the mother of choice, who was found in western halls, yet is counted among the Aesir goddesses? Why is she called the rejecter? Just a moment. Snorri and the poetic Edda speak nothing more of her, as if the poets were ashamed to mention what seems to have happened to her. But in Denmark, a contemporary of Snorri called Saxo Grammaticus wrote a work in Latin called Gesta Danorum, the history of the Danish people, and he offers a clue. Saxo was a devout Christian who despised the pagan religion with all his heart. Like Snorri, he explained the Aesir as a sort of ancestral tribe and described them as extremely dishonorable, despicable, and unsympathetic people. His story of Balder is very different from that of Snorri and of the Edda, possibly relating a different continental version, or Saxo's own version. In Saxo's story, Baldrus, this is in Latin, so Balder becomes Baldrus, of the despicable Aesir tribe contends with one Hötherus, that would be Höðr's tribe, over the maiden Nanna, which ends with Hötherus stabbing Baldrus with a magical sword. Odin, then proceeds on a mission to father his son's avenger. A strange story indeed. In the Danish version, Odinus, consults seers on how to get revenge, and they advise him to travel to the Ruthenians, disguised as a human warrior called Roster. He becomes a great asset to the king of the Ruthenians and is made a general. The king's daughter is called Rinda, like in Hrind, the Norse version. And Odinus, knows that he has to impregnate her to get his avenger born. Since she is destined to give birth to this avenger, Odinus needs to have a child with her. But Rinda refuses him twice. She thinks he is too old, and she is not impressed by the gold that he offers, since she has more than enough in her father's halls already. Odinus then strikes Rinda with a thorn that causes her to go insane and become ill. he turns into, that is Odin, changes shape, turns into a medicine woman called Vecca, pretending to have the medicine needed to cure Rinda. But the medicine is so bitter that they will have to tie the girl up in her bed. The people tie the princess to the bed and leave her alone with the medicine woman. Then the medicine woman, which is really Odin, takes advantage of the situation he has orchestrated and rapes the girl. From that rape was born a boy called Bous, which would later avenge Baldrus. Uthinus was punished by the other gods, by the Esi, and sent into exile for the crime of rape. Now, we are used to hearing of Vikings who raped and pillaged, but although this did happen, especially in raids abroad, there was no honor in raping women, and we have lots of saga sources telling a very different story at home, where rape is considered very dishonorable and punishable, even punishable by death sometimes. So in the poem Völuspå 35, rapists are counted among the murderers and oath breakers who will have to wade forever in the turbid streams of hell after death and during Ragnarok. It is entirely possible that Snorri omitted the truth of Våli's conception, as did the poets of the Edda, because it was so shameful. Contrary to Saxo, who cared nothing for the old gods, Snorri and the Icelanders who wrote down the Edda poems may have wished to tone down mythical events that could put the ancestral gods in a negative light. The massive silence about the fate of Rindir suggests that there really was a myth where the otherwise esteemed Allfather actually committed the lowly deed of raping the mother of his destined child. In fact, there are a few clues in the lore. In a skaldic poem by the skald Kormakur Ögmundarson called Sigurdarkvida, verse 3, well, this skaldic poem mentions that Odin seid till Rindar, which indicates that Odin used magic against Rind. Another clue is found in the Edda poem Grógaldr, where the old dead witch Gróa sings her spell songs to guide her son on his journey to woo the maiden in the underworld. In the first spell, Gróa declares that this Galdr, this spell, was first sung by Ran to Rindir. I read it. Moder kvad. Van gelek der fyrstan, van kväda fjölnytan, van golerindirani, att du av ökselskjoter, thvier der atalt tycker, sjalfer leiðu, sjalfan thick. Mother said, I sing the first Galdr then, I sing it well and completely. This was sung by Rani to Rindir. That you shake off your shoulders all that feels bad to you, lead you yourself, your own self. So not only does this verse refer to an aspect of the myth which is otherwise lost. When Rindir got advice from Ran, the goddess of the ocean, that mistress of death by drowning. Now since the form used is Rani, the importance is not on this goddess or giantess of the ocean, but on the meaning of the name, which means the robbery, referring to the rape itself. It's like a robbery of a piece of your, piece of yourself, perhaps. It is also advice about letting go of bad feelings, of letting go of the past and not to let it control you anymore. So it could be good advice for any victim of abuse or anyone who has been victimized to, you letting go means really let it off your shoulders. You don't have to carry it anymore. Doesn't mean that you should act as if it didn't happen, because it did. But I think the advice given here is that you don't let it pull you down. Other people's actions do not define you. They do not lead. They should not be able to lead your own path. You have to lead it yourself, not how other people treated you. That says nothing about you, how other people treated you. It says everything about the people who treated you, right? So, in order to truly understand this myth of the rape, we have to delve even deeper. We understand that Odin was willing to go into exile as a punishment for a very dishonorable and shameful crime. His need to impregnate the unwilling Rindir, prophesied to be the mother of Vali, and being more important than his good name, reputation, and status among the gods. So, somehow this was more important to him than to keep his honor and his... it was basically very, very important for him when he did that. He could... It is a bit like when he leaves Gunnlod weeping, and he sort of excuses himself by saying that, but because I did this, I left Gunnlod weeping, I betrayed her trust, but because of this, now the Mead of poetry is back in the world of the living. So he sort of justifies his shameful acts, the ones where he acts in a shameful, treasonous way. He excuses that with explaining that something good came out of it. It was necessary. So, rather than ignoring the story because it is unsavory, we should ask ourselves why he was willing to do that, and why the story was invented, and why it was told at all. We are moving into a territory that is difficult and sensitive, because we are still living in a time when women must often fight to free themselves from shame and sin when it comes to sexual abuse. Blame is so often placed on the victim, and it is and has been a long struggle to overcome these kinds of attitudes. So at first sight, the parable that I'm going to tell you, once deciphered, could give the impression that it blames the victim, but this is not so. This myth was created in a time when women's sexuality was quite acceptable and little shame attached to it, and certainly not sin. It was also created in a time when rape was unacceptable, yet could of course happen. However, there is only one way to really understand the entire myth, and that is through translating the names and taking the translations seriously. I would like to emphasize the fact that this is not a story about real events committed by real people, it is a parable. So, instead of going on about how Odin was a nasty, bad, rapist, abusive person, we should look at what Odin in this story represents, as well as what the others represent. So, a parable is a story that will use a situation that is recognizable from real life, such as a rape. Yet it will use the story to convey a deeper meaning. All the myths do this, but rarely have they used rape in a parable before. The rape is, as are all other mythical events, a metaphor. To understand the metaphor, we need only understand that a rape is essentially the loss of freedom, the loss of free will, and the loss of choice. It is the humiliation of being used, the fear of violence, and the feeling of being abused. In a parable, a woman getting pregnant is also a metaphor where she represents, for example, humanity creating something new. How this happens illustrates how the new creation is brought about. The parable is revealed when we understand that Odin, Odin, as I have explained before, it's a good well, it's a sort of a summarized interpretation, but basically I think it should be considered to be the spirit that seeks knowledge, the spirit that is aware, the spirit of consciousness growing and expanding awareness, breath, spirituality. This is an inspiration. That is what Odin sort of represents metaphorically, both by the meaning of his name and by his functions. If we understand him as the spirit as such, he represents the spirit not only of the world, but also of the individual and of a society. He also represents poetry and passion. So the point is that the spirit here, Odin, is not a man or a sort of person, man like God. He is not a nasty rapist, but simply that subtle thing which creates breath and inspiration and awareness in living things. He is the spurrer of all perception, experience and knowledge. And we understand the myth of Rindir only when we understand that her name indicates that she, her name meaning to reject, she rejects the spirit. Her name, from Herinda, to reject, hurl away from herself, speaks for itself. She rejects the spirit because it is too old and because she is content with her material wealth. As such, the rejecter represents a human society or an individual which rejects the spirit. Significantly, she is the princess of a realm which experiences constant battles. In this society, the representative for humanity, Rindir, the rejecter, well, because she rejects the spirit, she goes crazy. In this society, this representative for womanhood is tied to the bed and raped, robbed of her strength and of her self-respect. The impression that this is a metaphor for human society is strengthened by the mention of Western halls. In Norse myth, only the West is not mentioned among the directions belonging to gods, death, or giants, leaving the human world. And I think that's mentioned a few other times when they actually travel west when they go to see the human, walk into the human world. The sadness of this story is overwhelming. Not only do the spirit-rejecting human societies experience madness, meaningless battles, and severe oppression, the spirit is also exiled from the divine realms. However, after the rejecter manages to shake the bad feelings from her shoulders and learns to lead her own way, she gives birth to Vali, the choice to destroy blind aggression forever. The choice to put blind aggression to the pyre, as in to burn out. And the choice is, as I mentioned before, maybe not the best direct translation here, but rather it's like a spiritual path towards a different afterlife. It's connected to this, to the Val, to the Val, the people who go or are chosen to be revived there and fight on the gods' side against greed and all that during Ragnarök. It is a valiant choice that will restore the quality of Baldur, the greatness of mind, the fairness of understanding, and the courage of heart.